Hello everyone. On the screen you find are two questions. So these are two questions from a topic that you feel it's a very ordinary, very simple topic, right? It's a topic on revolutionary terrorism. So it's an area where a couple of years questions have been asked, and the questions that I have framed here, they have not been asked in the previous years, because I believe when it comes to history there are just so many areas where UPSC can ask questions, so you don't have to be confined to previous years questions, right? So what I have done in this entire lecture for the next 70-80 minutes is basically take up this very small area that is in the larger topic of revolutionary terrorism in India. I have only discussed the very first phase of revolutionary terrorism. The second phase will continue in a series in the next lecture. So the two questions have been simply formed out of the first phase of revolutionary terrorism, which is just from 1900 to 1920. So that was a phase in which we find certain strands of revolutionary terrorism in India, right? And what are the type of questions, what's the nature of questions asked from this topic? It's basically UPSC asks you questions about the different organizations and different personalities associated with that. That's one way of asking. Or a series of personalities can be given and UPSC would ask you, these persons are associated with so and so events, right? And you have to choose the right option among them. Or at times questions can be asked about the literature, revolutionary literature produced by these personalities, right? For example, Bandi Jeevan, it's a very powerful revolutionary literature written by Sachin Sanyal, right? So similarly, Arabindo Ghosh had written his own literature. He had been publishing his own newspaper. Similarly, Ram Prasad Bismil had written his own work on revolutionary terrorism, right? It's called as The Revolutionary. There are just so many such works which you will find mentioned in your spectrum. There is a table given in which all these works are mentioned, right? So how do you actually prepare on that? Either you go read spectrum and try to memorize whatever has been given in the table, which I feel it's very difficult, right? So that's one way of how you can get to know about all these works. Another way of how you can get to know about this is when you read them in detail, when you get exposed to all these in detail in a story like format, right? When you're able to interconnect all these revolutionaries together, when you feel that these revolutionaries have created a world of their own in which each one of them is familiar to each other, right? And if you know why would these literary works be produced, why would Indian sociologists be written by Shyamji Krishna Varma, if you would know the intent behind that, you would be able to remember things for a longer period of time. Okay, it's to drive in you this message. That's why I have chosen these two questions. My expectation is that you would be able to get at least one of these questions correct, right? Because some of you may be good with memorization. If that's the case, you should be getting the first option right. Okay, if not, there could be so many such areas in modern India history which you may not be able to recollect on the day of your examination. Okay, so that doesn't mean that you cannot crack this exam. No, maybe if you're too good with science, environment, geography, logic, everything, if you can employ, then you can afford to be a little bit weak when it comes to history. But if you don't feel confident that you will be getting more than 60-70% of the questions from those subjects right, then it's time at least you selectively choose certain areas from history and you at least try to become very good with those areas, right? That's the entire plan of this revision series itself. And as a part of this this particular small theme on revolutionary terrorism of the first phase, which went for 20 years from 1900 to 1920, has been delved in greater detail. All right, so that's the word of caution I have written here, that one of the question is supposed to be an easy question, and for those who feel that you can crack this exam with memory power, at least you should be then getting the first question right. Or otherwise, the second question is something if you have read in an interesting way about these revolutionaries, you would be able to get the second question right. All right, so the answer for the first question is only one. The reason is because Sachin Sanyal's book is Vichar Vinmay. Taraknath Das's publication was Free Hindustan, which he was publishing from Vancouver in British Columbia in Canada. And Shyamji Krishna Varma is the only correctly matched option, which is basically Indian Sociologist, was the newspaper started by him in London, right? So the first question, the answer is only one. And when it comes to second question, I'm sure you'll be confused here, because we all associate Subhash Chandra Bose with Indian National Army, right? But Subhash Chandra Bose took over the control of Indian National Army after the death of Rash Behari Bose. So the senior Bose, Rash Behari Bose, who ran away from India after the Ghadar incident failed in India, right? He ran away to Japan. And it is in Japan where he was the person who was instrumental in the starting of Indian National Army in Japan, right? You should at least be aware of the fact that Rash Behari Bose escaped to Japan. If that is the case, you would know he could not have been a part of Kakori train robbery, right? And Rash Behari Bose had never travelled to London. If that is the case, he could not have established India House in London, right? It is through these kind of interconnections you would be able to get the second question right. So expectation is at least one of the two you should have gotten right. If not, go read Spectrum. There are 2 chapters. In that you will be finding the answers for both of these. If not, pay attention to the next 60-70 minutes, in which I will be discussing in a very coherent, in a storytelling format, the answers for these 2 questions. The answers will be found as a part of the discussion lecture. Alright. In the Indian historical writing, the phase of revolutionary terrorism is often treated as an addition to Swadeshi movement, or simply seen as a continuation of non-cooperation movement. Right? We see revolutionary phase as if it's an intermittent gap-filling measure, as if the Congress activity had come down and revolutionary activities have just gone up. Right? So that actually minimizes the importance of this revolutionary phase. And you cannot expect moments of revolutionary terrorism without an undercurrent flowing throughout our national movement, right? So this revolutionary phase is just like another parallel stream to the mainstream of Indian national movement. It was always present from the first decade of 20th century, from 1900 onwards. You will find for the next 50 years, until India had got its independence, this revolutionary streak, this revolutionary idealism was always a part of Indian national movement. Right? It's only when you start minimalizing it, downplaying its importance to just a few persons, few events, then we start losing track of the big picture of revolutionary activism in India. So this lecture would be cautious in this regard. We'll try to interconnect revolutionaries across time and space. Right? It's because the revolutionaries of Bengal were always in touch with the Ghadar revolutionaries of Punjab. And V.D. Savarkar was always in touch with, let it be Hardayal, who was a Ghadar leader in US. At the same time, Savarkar was also in touch with Chandrasekhar Azad, who was a revolutionary activist in Uttar Pradesh. Right? So, and a person like Sachin Sanyal was a revolutionary for 3 different generations. Multiple generations of revolutionaries were inspired by Sachin Sanyal. And a man like Rash Behari Bose, who had carried out the bombing of Viceroy Lord Hardinge in Delhi, was also a very instrumental person in the founding of Indian National Army 30 years later. Right? So that's why the revolutionary network, the revolutionary ideologies were always present in India in the first 50 years of the 20th century. Right? So the purpose of this lecture is simply to form all the interconnections across the revolutionary phases, so as to make sure you're able to remember these interconnections on the day of your examination. Right? It wouldn't be justice to simply talk about the names of the revolutionaries, what were the incidents in which they were involved, and what was the revolutionary literature published by them. Simply just discussing about that would not be the purpose of this lecture. So it would be a detailed discussion. So that something about these revolutionaries still remains in your memory after the lecture has ended, and you are able to utilize this on the day of your exam if any questions are asked from this particular topic. Right? And where do we actually begin the discussion of this session? We started from Europe. It was because it was the Europe of the second half of 19th century, the first half of 20th century, which was very revolutionary. Right? Italian unification had just got completed. So there were a lot of Italian revolutionaries who have laid down their lives for the cause of Italian nationalism. And the Irish Catholics were revolting against the tyranny of the Protestant British crown. So Irish Republican movement was another strong current in European politics of the age. And not only that, there were Russian revolutionaries who have carried out daredevilry like bombing on the Tsar. the Tsar, the ruler of Russia, was subjected to bomb attacks by revolutionaries, common men. Right? It was these ideas which were commonplace in Europe during this period, as a result of which we have to turn our attention towards Europe, and that's where we start our discussion from. So the first person who can be called as the Mazzini of India, because it was Mazzini who was the father of Italian nationalism. It was he who sowed the ideas of Italian republicanism in the minds of Italians. He was able to bring out the feeling of nationalism and patriotism in the minds of Italians. Right? So a very similar figure in the Indian context, who would also be called as the Mazzini of India, would be Arabindo Ghosh. Right? So it would be very judicious to start the discussion of this chapter from Arabindo Ghosh. Arabindo Ghosh was a Bengali, but he was completely anglicized. The reason being that his father had taken up to Brahmo Samaj, as a result of which he was very fond of the West. Right? Arabindo's father was a civil surgeon employed in the service of the English East India Company in Bengal, and he was very particular that his sons would grow up as Englishmen. He really wanted all of his sons to become a part of the ruling class. He wanted his sons to appear in the Indian Civil Service Examination, ICS exam, but other sons couldn't live up to their father's expectations. It's only Arabindo who during his very early childhood he was transported to Britain. He was actually brought up in England as an Englishman. Right? He was brown in color, but in tastes, in studies, academics, he was completely an Englishman. So as expected, he went to Cambridge. After that, he sat for his ICS exams, cleared his ICS exams, but there was a last phase, a last test, which was the horse riding test. Right? So something struck Arabindo. Arabindo was smitten by the nationalist fever, which was there in Europe during this time. So he couldn't digest the thought of working under the same race, the same Englishmen who were oppressing Indians. So he decided to skip the horse riding test, as a result of which he was no more eligible for ICS, and his father got a heart attack listening to this news, and father died. So Arabindo had to seek a career now. Right? So he started finding a career in Britain, and that was the time when in 1893 the Maharaja of Baroda, Sayaji Gaikwad, so he was paying a visit to England. Right? And Sayaji Gaikwad came to know about Arabindo, and unlike other contemporaries of Sayaji Gaikwad, he was a bit more nationalist. Right? He was very different from his peers. While all other nobility, while all other princes were all bending and crawling before the British, the Maharaja of Baroda was made of a different metal. Right? So in fact, when the Delhi Darbar happened in 1911, the first time when a British ruler had come to India, so there was a series of protocols to be observed. But Sayaji Gaikwad never observed any of these protocols, and so he was very contemptuous, or you can say he was not as servile as all other Indian princes. So it was this Sayaji Gaikwad who was paying a visit to England in 1893. So he came across Arabindo. So Arabindo was inducted into Sayaji Gaikwad's bureaucracy. So he came to Baroda, and that was where Arabindo Ghosh first found a career in India. Right? And his work was very simple. His work was simply to draft letters, to draft English speeches for Sayaji Gaikwad, so as to deliver his speeches. Right? So that was his only work, and the work was not very interesting for Arabindo. So in his part time, Arabindo took up to writing a series of articles for a very nationalist revolutionary newspaper, which was published in Bombay during this time. In my previous lecture on the political associations formed in India before INC, I would have also made a mention about a newspaper by the name of Indu Prakash. Right? Indu Prakash was a Maratha journal. It's a Marathi journal, which was very critical about the British policies, and it was for this newspaper Arabindo from Baroda was contributing articles. Right? He used to write it under the series named as Old Lamps for New. Right? And it was in this series Arabindo was writing a series of articles putting forward his nationalist ideas. Right? So Arabindo was very familiarized with writing on nationalist issues, and it was during his stay in Baroda where he was visited by his brother from Bengal. His brother Arabindo Ghosh had come visiting his brother Arabindo along with sister Nivedita. I am sure you know who sister Nivedita was. She was a devotee, or she was a follower of Swami Vivekananda. Right? So sister Nivedita, Arabindo Ghosh makes a visit to Baroda, and it was they who informed Arabindo about the changes that were happening in Bengal during this time. It was during this time when Swadeshi movement had simply just started because of Curzon's proposal to divide Bengal, right? And it was in such a Bengal where a series of what is called as akhadas were being set up. What were these akhadas? These akhadas can be compared to today's shakas of RSS, right? So today's shakas of RSS, what do they teach youngsters there? They teach about patriotism, they teach about physical building, right? They impart exercises for youth. Similarly, these akhadas were created for very same purpose. It's just to make the Bengalis more manly, right? And what was the reason for that? Why would Bengalis want to be made more manly? It was because the British racial slur against the Bengalis, the British racial label against the Bengalis was that the Bengalis were effeminate, right? So it was a way of how Britishers used to put the Bengalis down by calling them, they are not as manly as that of the Punjabis. No wonder we have Sikhs as our army soldiers, whereas you Bengalis will not be able to recruit you because you don't have that manliness, right? And it was just very, very insulting to the Bengali pride. And with people like Swami Vivekananda, who had started creating a sense of revivalism in the minds of the Bengalis, now such akhadas started coming up everywhere in Bengal. So they were primarily to impart physical training, to build the strength of Bengali youth, right? And it is these akhadas who will play a great role in the upcoming years. It is these akhadas which will slowly become the samitis from where revolutionaries will be recruited for the nationalist cause. And one such samiti which becomes very prominent in Bengal would be the Anushilan Samiti. So this is a body which will be found by a person by the name of Sarat Chandra Bose, right? So even if you do not remember that, it's fine. Just understand the purpose of these samitis. These samitis are simply to impart physical training to make the Bengalis physically firm, so that whenever nation calls them for service, they are fit enough, they are bold enough, brave enough to devote themselves for the cause of Indian nationalism, right? So these akhadas have been springing up everywhere in Bengal, right? And the Swadeshi movement starts, and in the course of Swadeshi movement, the fracture of Congress takes place. Extremists, moderates, they part ways apart because of I'm sure you know about the reason why this rift happens between extremists and moderates. The main point of conflict is about extending the boycott, extending Swadeshi movement to all parts of India. So that was something that the extremists wanted to achieve, whereas the moderates did not want that to happen, as a result of which in Surat there was a fracture in Congress, right? So Arabindo had actually attended the session of Congress in Surat. So since he was in Baroda during this time, it was close by, so he had been a participant in Surat. So he had made friends with Lal Balpal, Lala Lajpat Rai, Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Bipin Chandrapal. So these extremist leaders have become familiar to Arabindo, and it was during this time when Arabindo makes the call to finally shift base from Baroda. So from Baroda now Arabindo shifts to Bengal, and after shifting to Bengal, he starts contributing to nationalist ideas. He starts writing. He starts a newspaper by the name of Yugantar, right? Yugantar actually translates into a new age, a new era. So it was a very revolutionary newspaper in which the ideas of Indian nationalism were all written, were all put forward by Arabindo Ghosh. All right, and not only that, he was also contributing to articles in another newspaper by the name of Bande Mataram, which was actually started and published by Bipin Chandrapal, another extremist leader. So Arabindo's words, Arabindo's ideas were reaching a bulk of the Bengali masses, and he was becoming a familiar name in the Bengali households, right? So these are where the questions can be asked. So you can just remember, Arabindo, after shifting base to Bengal, starts a journal by the name of Yugantar, right? And during the same time, Arabindo's brother Arabindo Ghosh, who was an active part of all these samitis, especially the Anushilan Samiti, had become very revolutionary, right? So there were a series of violent attacks which have been planned by the Anushilan Samiti members, and to carry out such violent attacks, first they need to know the technology of bomb making, right? So that is why a few members of Anushilan Samiti, they were sent to Paris, and it was Paris where all the revolutionaries of Europe used to congregate together. So it was in Paris where the Russian nihilists, the Russian terrorists who were carrying out the bomb attacks against the Tsar, so once the search for them intensifies in Russia, they all escape from Russia and they come to Paris. So a member from Anushilan Samiti, whose name was Hemachandra Das, so he was sent to Paris to learn the techniques of bomb making. And simultaneously another member in India itself, his name was Ullaskar Dutt. So Ullaskar Dutt in Bengal on his own had learnt how to make bomb, and with the help of such bomb making techniques they were able to mount a series of attacks. Two attacks prominent. First was an attack on the hated Lieutenant Governor of Bengal after Swadeshi movement started, right? So the Lieutenant Governor of Bengal, so he was actually subjected to bomb attack by these revolutionaries, but the revolutionaries were not caught. But in the next attempt on the magistrate, on a judge whose name was Kingsford, so it was a failed attempt. Both these attempts were a failure, right? It was an amateurish attempt by these revolutionaries, right? So their methods were crude, their strategies were not well planned out, as a result of which the outcomes were also not so successful. So the second attack was on the judge by the name of Kingsford, and he was very notorious, he was very infamous. The reason is because he used to give very harsh sentences to the Swadeshi protesters, right? So as to seek vengeance. That is why Ullaskar Dutt as well as Arabindo Ghosh had planned bomb attacks on the magistrate, right? But unfortunately the plan didn't go out as expected. The magistrate escaped, whereas a few other British ladies were all hurt, fatally wounded as a result of this bomb attack. And who carried out this bomb attack? It was two revolutionaries, two young boys. One of them was Khudiram Bose and the other one was Prafulla Chaki. So Prafulla Chaki and Khudiram Bose, they were members of Anushilan Samiti. So they were the ones who were deputed to carry out the assassination attempt on Kingsford. It was a failure. Khudiram Bose was caught immediately put to death by hanging, and Prafulla Chaki was arrested. His trials were just ongoing, and it was during this time the entire Anushilan Samiti network was infiltrated by British officers, right? They have found out the entire organizational leadership and structure, as a result of which a trial was instituted in the Sessions Court at Alipur. Okay, Alipur Sessions Court, a trial was instituted, and the name of the trial is very famous. It was called as the Emperor versus Arabindo Ghosh and others. Arabindo Ghosh was named as the prime accused, and others were all added as co-accused. And a young lawyer from Bengal who was just starting his practice had come to defend Arabindo Ghosh in this instance, and he was none other than Chittaranjan Das. It was because Arabindo couldn't afford any other senior lawyers, so a junior lawyer, Chittaranjan Das, who had simply started his practice, now appeared, defended Arabindo, and finally there were no incriminating evidences against Arabindo, as a result of which he was let to go free. Whereas many others, some of them were put to death and many others were transported to Andamans for life. And those who were sent to Andaman, they were none but the brother of Arabindo, Baran Kumar Ghosh. So he was sent to Andamans, as well as Ullaskar Dutt. Right? They were given life imprisonment, but later their sentences will be reduced, and after the Jallian Walla Bagh tragedy takes place in 1920s or 21, they will be released out of prison. Their sentences will be reduced as a gesture of goodwill. They will be released, but as of now the punishment given to them was life imprisonment. So Arabindo Ghosh released for lack of evidence, and once he was released, Arabindo could understand that both Yugantar as well as Bande Mataram had been seized by the Britishers. So these publications no longer even exist. They cannot be allowed to publish under the same name, and that is when Arabindo starts a new publication by the name of Karma Yogi. Right? So it was the publication which Arabindo starts just because his earlier ones have all been seized by the Britishers. Alright, and Arabindo becomes a famous celebrity across India, and in fact later British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, who would later one day become the British Prime Minister, would even pay a visit to Arabindo, hearing about his popularity. Right, so such was the popularity of Arabindo in India, and he continues writing nationalist ideas. He continues delivering lectures in various places, as a result of which the British monitoring and supervision on Arabindo tightens. There was always a fear that what if Arabindo is caught and he's transported to Mandalay or to Andamans. Right, so these were the two prisons which were notorious during this time. The two most dreaded prisons, the two most feared prisons, was the one at Mandalay in Burma, the other one being the cellular jail in Andamans. And very few people even come out of Andaman prison alive. It's because the treatment is so harsh, the weather is so bad, and mosquitoes are just everywhere. Very few people are even able to overcome the torture and the agony that they actually suffer in Andaman. So that's why it's called as the Kala Pani, black waters. Once people go there, it's very hard for them to come out alive. Right? So there was always the possibility, this reality, that Aravindo would be imprisoned for life, imprisoned under some conditions or the other. Right? And because that's how Balagangadhar Tilak was actually arrested for sedition, because of writing articles against the government in his Marathi newspaper, Kesari. So he was arrested under grounds of sedition, and he was sent to prison for 7 years in Mandalay in Burma. Right? So same fate would probably await Arabindo, as a result of which Arabindo escaped to the French enclave of Chandranagore. I'm sure you would have heard about Chandranagore in Bengal, which was actually under the French. So Arabindo thought he would be safe here, but even then, even in Chandranagore, there is always a possibility that the Britishers could come and arrest him. So that is when Arabindo finally decides to leave Chandranagore. He takes a ship by the name of Duplex. Duplex was a ship that carried him from Chandranagore, went to Pondicherry, and in Pondicherry, the Mazzini of India, Arabindo, had finally given up all his political pursuits. Right? So he had taken up to spirituality. He had taken up as his life mission the preservation and the protection and the promotion of Sanatan Dharma. Right? The word Sanatan Dharma would be very controversial today, but back then for him Sanatan Dharma really just represented the traditional Vedic form of Indian religion. Right? So for the next 30 years, Arabindo would simply devote his life, devote his cause for the promotion of Sanatan Dharma. And the next time when Arabindo would be heard uttering anything political would be during the time of Cripps mission in 1942. So that was the time when Arabindo comes out of his political exile, and he gives a statement asking Indian leaders to go and be a part of the Cripps mission negotiations. Right? For the next 30 years, this man becomes a political exile. He is no longer actively into politics. But the impact of Arabindo was very profound. It's Arabindo's impact which will in fact nurture the next generation of revolutionaries in Bengal. And one such man who would have been impacted by Arabindo, who would want to take up this revolutionary path during this time, was Rash Behari Bose. So Rash Behari Bose would be brought up in Chandranagore. Right? It was his maternal home at Chandranagore, born and brought up there. So there was definitely anti-British sympathies that he had, and Rash Behari Bose was able to get himself a career under the English rule. So he was made as a clerk in the Forest Research Institute at Dehradun. So this was when the Bengali Rash Behari Bose comes into contact with various revolutionary leaders from the other corner of India, which is actually Punjab. So during Rash Behari Bose's stay at Dehradun, he comes into contact with people like Ajit Singh. And who was Ajit Singh? Ajit Singh was the uncle of Bhagat Singh. Right? Ajit Singh, and there was another school teacher by the name of Amir Chand. So it was these revolutionaries with whom Rash Behari Bose would get into touch with. And you may ask me, how did Punjab become a hotbed of revolution? It was simply because of two reasons. So Punjab society, it had two main populations. Apart from Muslims, you had the Sikhs and then you have Hindus. So among the Sikhs in the 1850s, you would find a revivalist movement by the name of Namdari movement, and this Namdari movement over time would become very, very violent, right? So as a result of which there will be clashes between Britishers and the Sikhs. Sikhs end up dying in the violent clashes. So there is a lot of bad blood that exists between the Sikhs and the Englishmen, right? Even though the Sikhs have been very loyal to the British in suppressing the revolt of 1857, right? It was only with the help of the Sikh regiment they were able to come to Delhi and put down the Mughal uprising. But the loyalty of the Sikhs over the time will become weakened as a result of this Namdari movement. Alright, and among the Hindus we have the Arya Samaj, which will be a revivalist movement to create the pride of Hinduism, to create the pride of Indianness in the minds of Hindus. Right, even Bhagat Singh being a Sikh, Ajit Singh being a Sikh, but they were all members of Arya Samaj movement. As a result of which, this revolutionary spirit has now come to Punjab. Right, it is these Punjabi revolutionaries who now, along with Rash Behari Bose, they all make a plan so as to carry out something unthinkable, and that's the assassination attempt on Viceroy Hardinge, because it was in the year 1911 when the capital was shifted from Calcutta to Delhi. So Lord Hardinge thought a man of his stature should have a grand entry into Delhi, right, in order to remind the people of the old Mughal days. So Hardinge mounted an elephant and he wanted to enter the lanes of Chandni Chowk. Chandni Chowk today is in the old area, old part of Delhi, right? Even today if you go there you can find the old Mughal gates. So it was through those gates Hardinge mounted an elephant and he wanted to make a grand entry, and it was during that occasion Rash Behari Bose, along with another accomplice from Bengal whose name was Basant Biswas, right? It was Rash Behari Bose and Basant Biswas together. They would just throw a bomb at Lord Hardinge, but again another failed attempt. So Hardinge would not die, he will survive his injuries, but the perpetrators would not be apprehended, they would not be caught, and this becomes a national sensation. So this is something that almost all revolutionaries across India would take pride at the daredevilry, at an attempt made even on the highest official in India, right, and the accused and the perpetrators not even being caught, right. So Rash Behari Bose once again goes back to FRI, he continues his work as a clerk, right, and outwardly he doesn't display any sympathy towards a nationalist cause. In fact, Lord Hardinge would after that make a visit to FRI in Dehradun, where he would be welcomed by the very same Rash Behari Bose, right. So such was his masterly attempt at disguising his intentions. He was never making his intentions public. There was not an iota of suspicion on Rash Behari Bose. But Basant Biswas, he would make a similar bomb attack on officials at Lahore, as a result of which he will be caught. And once he is caught, he confesses about the attack that was carried on in Delhi, right? And that is when the position of Rash Behari Bose is compromised. So he immediately runs, coming back to Chandranagore. And this is where Rash Behari Bose meets two other young Bengalis who would also alter the course of revolutionary movement in the days to come. They are none but Sachin Sanyal and Jatindranath Mukherjee, who is also called as the Baga Jatin, right. It's because the word Bag in Bengali, it means tiger. So there's a story that Jatin had single-handedly killed a tiger, right, as a result of which this name seemed to have stuck on to him. So he was called as the Baga Jatin and Sachin Sanyal. So Rash Behari Bose is once again back to Bengal in Chandranagore, and that's where he meets Sachin Sanyal, Baga Jatin, and now they all make a grand plan, and that grand plan is simply to repeat 1857, that is to create incitement in the Indian army and to make the Indian army soldiers rise up in a revolt against their British masters, right. So this is what they are looking for, but they have a problem here in Bengal. The problem is that the old Anushlan Samiti network has been dismantled. Just because Arabindo Ghosh has been imprisoned, there is no leadership for Anushlan Samiti, and whatever remained of Anushlan Samiti is fragmented into pieces. There is no coordination, right. So they simply just don't have any manpower to carry out this grand plan, to carry out this grand feat. right? So that's why they had to wait for some time until the Ghadar movement reaches India, right? So now is the time to have a look at the Ghadar movement, as well as the movement that was going on in Maharashtra and Gujarat, right? So let's have a look at that. Let's turn our attention towards Bombay, right? So in the British province of Bombay, there was a man by the name Shyamji Krishna Varma. So he was a Gujarati, and he was a member of Arya Samaj, again as a result of which he was exposed to Indian history, Indian religion, and he was a scholar of Sanskrit. In fact, Shyamji Krishna Varma was so good at Indian history, Indian literature, Sanskrit literature, that he was even invited to London to become a member of Royal Asiatic Society. You may ask me, what is this Royal Asiatic Society? If you would remember, in Bengal, during the tenure of Warren Hastings, Asiatic Society of Bengal would be set up. And what is the purpose of Asiatic Society of Bengal? It's simply to study and to understand Indian history, right? A similar initiative would be taken in London so as to create an interest in the study of Indian history, and that society is what is called as the Royal Asiatic Society. So Shyamji Krishna Varma was so good in Indian literature and in Sanskrit that he was even asked to become a member of Royal Asiatic Society in England. So Shyamji Krishna Varma goes to England, and he finds that the atmosphere in England, the ecosystem in England is much more liberal than what he finds in India. And being a nationalist at heart, he would want to write his ideas, he would want to propagate his ideas of Indian nationalism. He finds it's better to be in Europe and to carry out his activities. And Shyamji Krishna Varma also had a talent in finance. So he had made some significant investments in stock market, as a result of which he was able to make a great fortune in stock market. And the money that he earned from the stock market, he directed it to 3 different pursuits. One, he started a newspaper which was called as the Indian Sociologist, in which he started expressing his nationalist ideas. Second, he started a lodging facility in London, right, which was called as the India House. And the main reason for India House was to support the deserving Indian students. When they come to England, they find it's very difficult to survive in England. Getting vegetarian food would be a luxury in England, right? And to have a sense of camaraderie, have a sense of bonhomie with Indians, that's why he would want an establishment in India, in London, which can actually house, which can be a boarding facility for Indian students who come there to pursue their dream of becoming an ICS officers, right? In fact, every prominent Indian would have visited India House during this time. Gandhi ji was a visitor to India House. So when Gandhi had visited India House, he had even met Savarkar during the same time, and their encounter was very, very unpleasant. Gandhi was a strict vegetarian, but Savarkar was frying his prawns. So there was a hostility between them, ranging back to the days of the stay in India House. All right. And thirdly, Shyamji Krishna Varma had even initiated what are called as the scholarships for deserving Indian students. Right, these scholarships were named after Maharana Rana Pratap scholarship, and then there was another scholarship by the name of Chhatrapati Shivaji scholarship, then Akbar scholarship. So these were the names of scholarships which Shyamji Krishna Varma had instituted. So these were the 3 initiatives taken by Shyamji Krishna Varma to attract talent from India. Right. So Lala Hardayal was a resident in India House. Savarkar was a resident. Okay, Madan Lal Dhingra, who will carry out further assassinations in London, he was a resident of India House. And finally, India House itself will be shut down by the British authorities as a hub, as a production house of terrorists. Right. So this was the impact of Shyamji Krishna Varma. So when you're asked a question on him, it could be touching upon these 3 aspects. Right. So what you have to remember here is the publication issued by Shyamji Krishna Varma in London, which was a revolutionary publication by the name of Indian Sociologist. All right. So once the scholarship was instituted, the scholarship was actually given to a young Brahmin boy from Nasik, whose name was V.D. Savarkar. right? So let's turn our attention to Nasik. Okay. So V.D. Savarkar, if you see a common pattern among all these revolutionaries were born to probably middle class or the rich sections of the society, right? Arabindo or Shyamji Krishna Varma or Hardayal or Madanlal Dhingra, who will even give up his life trying to by assassinating an Englishman in London. He was born to doctor parents, right? So that was the character, that was the nature of the revolutionaries who were participants in the first phase of the revolutionary terrorism. They all came from the upper sections of the society. All right. Same was the case with V.D. Savarkar. So Savarkar was also born to a decently well-off family, and Savarkar was a very young boy when he heard about a great assassination that took place in Bombay. It was in, I think, 1899, during that time when there was a plague epidemic which was going on in Bombay, right? And the countermeasures taken by the authorities were very, very repressive. British officers, policemen, they used to simply break into houses, they used to drag Indian women, take them to isolation quarters, containment zones, right? As a result of which the honor of Indian women, the Marathi women, were all molested, right? The women felt at least molested, so the measures were very, very inhumane. All right. And I've already told you in a previous lecture that Pune was a place of extremist politics, right? The same Chitpavan Brahmins who were under the service of Marathas, these were the sections, after the conquest of Marathas by the Britishers, they felt their traditional forms of livelihood were all affected, as a result of which the Pune Brahmins were in particular very hostile against the Britishers, right? So it was in Pune where an assassination will be done, and that assassination will be carried out by two brothers in Pune. They were called as the Chapekar brothers. These Chapekar brothers, they were Brahmins, right? The Pune Brahmins, who would carry out an assassination of officer by the name of Walter Rand. So Walter Rand was the chairman of the Plague Commission, which was responsible for containing plague in Pune, right? So this man, who was the chairperson, will be killed by the Chapekar brothers, and the Chapekar brothers will again, they will be put to death, they will be hanged. But this incident would have affected Savarkar when he was a young boy, right? So when the Chapekar brothers were hanged, that was a time when he visited a temple and he prayed to the goddess there that he'll one day chase the Britishers out of India, right? So Savarkar was able to get himself admitted into the Ferguson College. So Ferguson College is a very famous college even today in Pune, right? Many civil servants every year from Maharashtra would be actually alumni of Ferguson College, right? So Savarkar was an alumni of Ferguson College. So during his studies in Ferguson College, he had organized certain societies very similar to the Anushlan Samiti, right? So in Maharashtra, so he had been instrumental in setting up certain societies which were called as the Mitra Melas, right? Mitra Melas, it's a grouping of friends, right? So people used to come, they used to discuss about international revolutionary currents that were going on in Europe, right? So a lot of discussions used to happen over the Italian nationalist movement, Irish Republican movement. That's how the students were getting exposed to revolutionary ideas, and over time these Mitra Melas would be formed into a new body by the name of Abhinav Bharat, right? You can find the name very similar to the name given to the Italian nationalist movement called as Young Italy. So Young Italy was the body started by Mazzini in Italy, right? So Mazzini's Young Italy was a great inspiration for Indian revolutionaries across periods, and Savarkar was equally inspired by reading the 6 volumes written by Mazzini on his nationalist movement, right? So very similar to Young Italy, Savarkar names his Mitra Mela as Abhinav Bharat. Abhinav is young or new, Bharat is new India, right? Very similar, right? So this was a body that Savarkar would be forming in India, all right? And it was during this time Savarkar gets the scholarship. He goes to England, and one of the main conditions of the scholarship is that By the time the students reach England, they are asked to sign in a declaration, and the declaration is that after my studies in England, I will never take up any employment under the English government, right? So it was such kind of students who actually give such an undertaking. They will be the ones who would be admitted into the Indian house, right? So when Savarkar was there, he was able to spread this extremist mindset, extremist ideas to all the members who were staying in India house, right? And India house was also a meeting place of revolutionaries from different parts of the world. In fact, Lenin, who would be the father of Russian revolution, would also pay a visit to Savarkar at his Indian house, right? So it was becoming a hub of revolutionary activism, and that's why British intelligence always used to post officials just outside the India house, screening all those and noting down all those who actually make a visit to the Indian house. Okay, and it was in the year 1907, on the 1st of May, which was actually the golden jubilee of the revolt of 1857. It has been 50 years since the revolt of 1857 had been suppressed, right? As a celebration of that, the British newspapers would carry out a lot of articles in which the heroism of a lot of British officers who suppressed the 1857 revolt would all be recounted, right? Their stories, their histories will all be written. And this is something that Savarkar found to be too offensive. He feels that the narrative that's been propagated in the British media was not actually the correct narrative. It was not the correct understanding of revolt of 1857, right? And imagine that was the time when Indian nationalist leaders of Congress, the moderates, they were all expressing they were having an apologetic feeling towards what had happened in 1857. In fact, Syed Ahmad Khan would even go to the extent of negating 1857 by writing his own book called as Causes of 1857 Revolt, right, in which he puts forward that we Muslims are not, by nature, we are not revolting against the British, we welcome the British rule. So that's the kind of tone that the Indian nationalist leaders of that time used to exhibit about what had happened in 1857. But by contrast, Savarkar writes a book called as Indian War of Independence, right, in which strong nationalist sentiments are expressed. All fingers were pointed at the Britishers as the perpetrators of evils which led to final outbreak of 1857 revolt. A counter narrative was what Savarkar wanted the English audience to know. So he writes this book called as Indian War of Independence, right? But this book will be banned for publication in India. Why? Because the book has the potential of inflaming the loyalty of the Indians who were employed in the British army in India, right? What if Indians read it? What if the British soldiers who were there in the Indian army, what if they revolt once again against their masters? So that's why this book, Indian War of Independence, published by Savarkar, would not be allowed entry into India. So that's why it had to be smuggled by having fake covers of various other novels, famous English novels. All of that cover will be put on that, and it will be smuggled into India, because it was not even allowed to be printed in England. So Savarkar had to find printers in Holland, France, and Hardayal used to have an edition printed in USA, right? So that was how various copies of Indian War of Independence would be brought to India, right? So this is something that you can remember with respect to Savarkar. The book that he had written was the Indian War of Independence. The main reason why he had written this book was to give a counter narrative to what the British actually knew about the revolt of 1857, right? And from now onwards, the supervision on Savarkar actually becomes tighter and tighter. The Englishmen are more vigilant over the activities of Savarkar. And in addition to that, in India during this time, in Bombay, a series of assassination attempts will be made. Assassinations will be done successfully by members of Abhinav Bharat, right? So and because of Savarkar's activities, some members of Savarkar's family will be arrested. They will be arrested by the district magistrate, the collector of I think Nasik. So he'd be arresting Savarkar's family members, and they'll be handcuffed and dragged onto the streets, right? So perceiving that as an insult, members of Abhinav Bharat would go and assassinate this district magistrate who went by the name of Jackson. So the Jackson district magistrate would be assassinated by the members of Abhinav Bharat, right? And using this as a pretext, extradition. I hope you know what an extradition means. Extradition is basically Savarkar is requested by the Indian government here to be sent to India right? So basically British officers in London, they have to arrest Savarkar and they have to deport him to India so that Savarkar can be tried in India for the crimes of Abhinav Bharat, for his participation in fomenting the assassinations that have happened in India, right? And Savarkar will be actually apprehended by the British police. He'll be sent to India, and meanwhile, during the course of his journey, he would even make a escape attempt. In fact, he would escape from the ship when the ship was anchored in in France, right? He would even make an escape attempt, but then he'll be caught by the French policemen, handed over to the English party accompanying and escorting him. So they'll carefully bring him to India, and in India, Savarkar will be tried by a special tribunal formed for this purpose, and he would be given a 50 years imprisonment and sent to Andamans, right? So that is why Savarkar had to wear a number plate in Andamans, which actually read 1960, right? Which means that was the year on which he will be released from the prison, just to remind him of what he has lost. A big part of his life is lost, right? So Savarkar went to England when he had his first son, who was only 18 months old, and his first son will eventually die. So by the time Savarkar returns back to India, he's directly packed, sent to Andamans. So it was later in 1920s when he will be brought from Andaman to mainland. He'll be kept in Ratnagiri in Maharashtra until 1937, and it is only after 1937 when finally Savarkar will be released. And by then Savarkar would have become a great loyalist of the British rule, right? He would want British rule to be in India. In fact, Savarkar would be the person to vouch to support Indian participation in British war efforts in the Second World War, right? Why? Because Savarkar by then had become very much concerned about the growth of Muslim League. He doesn't want the Muslims, through their Muslim League, to win the sympathies of British. So he wanted Hindus also to have a protection, a buffer, by winning the hearts of Englishmen. So that's why Savarkar's stance towards the British would completely change from 1937 onwards. And no wonder Savarkar is very controversial today. So the right wing, it looks at Savarkar as the brave Savarkar, Veer Savarkar, whereas others would be very critical, skeptical about Savarkar and his role, his contribution in later stages of Indian national movement, right? So we would leave it to the students of history to have a judgment on what kind of a person Savarkar was, right? So with this, the journey of Savarkar ends, all right? So now let's turn our attention to America, to North America. So in America during this time, you would find a lot of Punjabis, especially Sikhs, finding their way to Canada, because Canada was also a part of the British Empire, right? So since Indians start their journey, they go to Japan, and from Japan they come to the west coast of North America. They have a tendency to settle down on the western part of Canada. So this is what was called as British Columbia, and its capital was Vancouver, right? So Vancouver had a very sizable number of Indians who had started settling down, all right? And the disloyalty towards the British Raj, which I told you had started in the minds of Sikhs, had also affected the Indian immigrants who lived in British Columbia, right? And this feeling of hatred towards the Britishers were actually spread through the Gurudwara networks. The Gurudwaras that were there were very active in keeping this anti-British spirit alive. And what you need to know about the early Indian activism, revolutionary activism in Canada, was that an Indian by the name of Taraknath Das, so he had started a revolutionary newspaper in Vancouver, right, which was called as the Free Hindustan. So Free Hindustan was a revolutionary publication of Taraknath Das. So it was pointing out the misdeeds of the Britishers, it was pointing out to the hatred against the British. All of that was finding its voice in Free Hindustan. And the British government in Canada was trying its best to prevent any further immigration into Canada. It was tightening the conditions for immigration, right? It was very discriminatory against Indians. And I'll tell you an example here. If an immigrant were to migrate from Japan, he simply has to carry with him $40. If he has 40 US dollars, he is simply allowed entry to Canada. But for an Indian, the sum was $200, which was very huge for that time, right? So it was very, very discriminatory against Indians to prevent any further Indian immigration into Canada, right? So since the conditions were becoming very oppressive, so that's when Indians who have already settled down in Canada, now they felt it's better to seek a living in the western coast of US. It's because the western coast of US has started developing during this time. There was a lot of railway network laying work, right? Rail, road, all of that was being developed in California during this time. So that's when Indians, they found ready employment opportunities to be available in US. So from Canada they started shifting base to USA, right? And as usual, Free Hindustan was also being published from US, and in fact it was much more easier to operate from US because US was a land of liberty, and it's an independent country, so you don't have any problem if you were to criticize against the Britishers and publish articles in USA, right? It's only when USA becomes an ally of England in 1917 during the time of First World War, that is when conditions become very strict in USA. So until then, now USA is like the new safe haven for Indians to come and migrate in large numbers. And that is when a young student by the name Lala Hardayal, right? So Lala Hardayal from Punjab, he goes to England, studies in England, and he finds that he can vent out his nationalist feelings better in US than in England. And that's when Lala Hardayal finally makes his way, settles down in California, and he used to visit Stanford, he used to visit the Berkeley University of California campus. He goes there, addresses Indian students, and Indian students by this time, they have been given a lot of scholarships by some Indians who have made a huge fortune in US, right? So there was one Sardar, one Singh, who had become so profitable because of the potato business, right? He used to be called as the Potato Singh. So such big names have instituted scholarships to fund Indian students, right? So now USA is the next hub for Indian students, and especially the western coast. So we already have a sizable number of Indian students studying in different universities in the western coast. And that's when Hardayal makes his entry, and Hardayal, with this strong anti-British feeling, with the strong opinions on nationalist issues, so he was able to strike a chord among the Indian students. He was very popular among the Indians, right? And it is Hardayal who starts a newspaper by the name Ghadar, right? And he wanted his intention to be crystal clear about why he has started this newspaper. In fact, the tagline of Ghadar was Angrezi ka dushman, enemy of the British. So as to leave no doubts about the real intent behind the publication, right? It was very, very vocal, critical against the British, but the Britishers simply cannot do anything because USA is an independent country. The Britishers have no control over what can be published and what should not be published in US, right? So Ghadar was a publication which was actually a hit among various Indian diaspora living in different parts of the world, right? There were Indian diaspora who were living in Malaya, in Malaysia, Singapore. There were Indians who were living in huge numbers in Japan. In fact, you will find Rash Behari Bose, who we have discussed a while ago, right? So when it becomes very difficult for him to operate in India, the destination that he'll be making is to Japan, in which he even goes there, settles down, marries a Japanese wife, lives there for 30 years, and then he was the first person to find the Indian National Army in Japan, and then he'll be searching for the right commanding officer for his Indian National Army, and that is when the choice of Subhash Chandra Bose would strike him, and finally Bose, the senior Bose, Rash Behari Bose, would even die. Then the leadership comes under the control of Subhash Chandra Bose, right? So Japan was another country, a foreign country, where a lot of Indians used to live and operate and carry out anti-British activities. And the Japanese were very welcoming of these initiatives. It's because Japan considered itself to be the leader of all Asiatic countries. There was a feeling of pan-Asianism, and Japan considered itself to be the natural leader of Asians. So anything that's critical against the white man, against the West, Japan was always welcoming such moves. And that was a time when Japan had also fought a war against the white man Russia, defeated the Russians. So Japan considered itself to be the natural leader, and so it allowed and encouraged all these kind of anti-white activities, right? So there was a significant Indian population in Japan, then there were Indians in Malaya, Singapore, then there were Indians in Siam, in Vietnam, right? Manila in Philippines. So it was in all these areas where you will find Ghadar network expanding, right? So Ghadar newspapers used to be read in all these enclaves of Indian diaspora. So the Indian diaspora in all these enclaves were becoming very vocal and critical against the British, right? It is this diaspora which will be the reason for the next agitations of revolutionary terrorism in India, right? We'll see what is that. That's an incident which is called as the Komagata Maru incident. Komagata Maru, right? This is basically a Japanese word. It's a name of a ship. A Japanese ship has a name called Komagata Maru. It's basically a coaling ship. It's a ship for transporting coal over long distance. And an Indian entrepreneur, Singh, right? So he was he tried to use this ship to transport Indians from all the way from Punjab, from India, right? From Calcutta, basically. Indians board the ship Komagata Maru. They were all looking to emigrate out of India. So they all wanted to go to Canada, right? In a coaling ship. So the facilities are very bad in the ship, just because the fare will be very, very minimum. That is why this ship was used by Indians to travel from India to Canada. And by the time they reached Canada, the Canadian authorities have made immigration almost impossible, right? It's because the First World War had broken out. Okay, and already these Punjabis have started having anti-British sentiments in their mind. If only a big group of Punjabis were to now land in British Columbia in Canada, definitely the situation in Canada will become very troublesome. So the Britishers would take all possible measures to prevent any further emigration into Canada, right? So the ship will be docked in the harbour, kept there for months together, with no Indian allowed to disembark from the ship. And already, as I told you, it's a coaling ship. You don't have any comfortable facilities in the ship, right? So the Indians are very, very agitated since they were denied entry into Canada. Now the ship has to make a return once again back to India to drop all the passengers. And while the ship was traveling back, the ship made halts in Japan, in Malaya, Singapore, right? So wherever the ship docked, wherever the ship had made halt, the Indian passengers, the Punjabis, they were all subjected to a lot of brainwashing. They were indoctrinated with this Ghadar network. So very, very revolutionary ideas were all spoken, and it was all conveyed, transmitted to these Indian passengers. And moreover, the kind of treatment that they received in the British hands in Canada, the passengers were all very, very inflamed, right? So it's this ship carrying a lot of agitated revolutionaries, which is on its way to reach Calcutta. So it reached the Baj port of Calcutta, docked there. The Britishers were still not allowing the passengers to disembark. The Britishers were allowing the Indians to get down one condition only, that is, a direct train will be arranged from Calcutta to carry all of them back straight to Punjab, right? Because the Britishers were able to understand that all these passengers are now in a revolutionary mood. What if they are allowed to get into Bengal? What if they are allowed to get into Bombay? Right, they can go and start sowing dissension in the minds of Indians, right? So that's why the Britishers at all costs would want to simply transport all these Ghadarites or the Ghadar influenced the Punjabi passengers. All of them have to be now taken straight back to Punjab, right? And many of the passengers, they wanted to actually get down from the ship and they wanted to spend some time in Calcutta, right? But they were prevented from doing so, and then a gunfight followed, as a result of which some of the passengers were even killed in this issue, right? But what is the ultimate point here? The point is, a lot of Ghadar thoughts, and the Ghadar newspaper was even forbidden to be published in India. It was forbidden to even be brought to India, right? A Sea Customs Act was actually passed in 1914, as a result of which Ghadar paper was banned in India, right? And all the thoughts are now carried by these passengers, right? It's going to be a very explosive situation, and it is this Ghadar network of those people who have infiltrated into India, right? It is they who are going to form the manpower formed the backbone for which Rash Behari Bose, Sachin Sanyal, Bhaga Jatin, right, they are waiting. And what are they waiting for? They are waiting to create instigation, it's to create dissension in the minds of Indian soldiers in the Indian National Army, right? And who better than Punjabi Sikhs? If the Punjabi Sikhs can go and talk to other Punjabi soldiers in the Indian National Army, definitely there is a possibility of rioting happening, correct? So it is with this newfound network where the Bengali trio, Rash Behari Bose, Sachin Sanyal and Bhaga Jatin, they contact the leaders of the Ghadar party, Ghadar movement, right? And it is with their support they want to create this uprising in a mutiny in the Indian army. But the British intelligence was also very smart. They had found out what their intention actually is, as a result of which many Ghadar leaders, they were all arrested. So as a result of which the supposed revolt in the Indian army never happened, right? It's because without weapons, without arms and ammunition, you cannot carry out such a grand uprising, and that's why you need the support of Indian soldiers. But Indian soldiers were in no mood to militate against their British masters. So it was a disappointment for Bose, Sachin Sanyal as well as for Bhaga Jatin. And that is when now another plan was made, okay? And this plan was to directly contact the Ghadar leaders who were in USA during this time, and those Ghadar leaders were in touch with the German embassy in Washington, right? So with the help of the German embassy in America, a lot of German weapons, a lot of German rifles and rounds of ammunition were all packed in a ship, and that ship was supposed to come to the coast of Orissa, right? Today if you go to Orissa, in the northern part of Orissa, just the district that borders Bengal, it's a district called Balasore, okay? It was in the district of Balasore, it was in this coast where a German ship was supposed to come carrying arms and ammunition and make a drop here. And who was sent to collect this catch of ammunitions coming? It was Bhaga Jatin who was sent to go retrieve the ammunition and bring it so as to distribute it among the Bengali revolutionaries, right? And to, just because the Indian army, the Indian soldiers of the Indian British army is not going to be supportive anymore, you need arms and ammunitions yourself. So that's the plan. The plan is basically a German ship will come, it will drop ammunitions, and those ammunitions will find its way to all Indian revolutionaries, and then there will be an uprising against the British, right? But once again, British intelligence were able to apprehend the ship. It's because the German officer in charge in the German embassy, who was in charge of all this operation, so he was actually arrested by the British Secret Service, and he had simply revealed all the plan. So the ship never came, but finally the British officials followed Bhaga Jatin to Balasore, and here gunfighting took place, as a result of which Bhaga Jatin was severely injured, and the next day in hospital he passed away, right? So one member finished, but slowly the entire plan, the entire operation, the leadership of Sachin Sanyal and Rash Behari Bose was all now known to the British police, right? It's becoming difficult for Rash Behari Bose to operate in India. That is why now Rash Behari Bose takes a ship, he books a ticket under the name of P.N. Tagore, right? Because Rabindranath Tagore was a very famous poet in the world during this time, and people in Japan were expecting his arrival. So now Rash Behari Bose disguises himself as a cousin of Rabindranath Tagore, right? Under the pseudonym, under the fake name of P.N. Tagore, he boards a ship, goes to Japan, right? And in Japan he spends the next 30 years of his life and finally dies in Japan, right? The last man standing here would be Sachin Sanyal, and Sachin Sanyal would be now arrested by the police, because the entire plan, entire operation, entire idea to incite a revolt in the army is all now discovered by the British police, right? So that's why the Ghadar conspiracy trials will now take place in India. Many of the Ghadar leaders will be tried and they will be imprisoned, and so will be Sachin Sanyal. So this is the first time Sachin Sanyal is now sent to Andamans, right? So he would be the only person who would be sent to Andaman twice. So first during this failed attempt, and once again in 1921 he will be released, comes back to the mainland, once again reorganizes his network, and now he dares to commit another raid, which is called as the famous Kakori train robbery, and that will also be a failed attempt in which the revolutionaries will be caught, and once again Sachin Sanyal will be given another series of imprisonment to be sent back again to Andamans. Right? So Rash Behari Bose is out of India, Bhaga Jatin is killed in conflict, and Sachin Sanyal now transported to life to Andamans. Right? And with this, the Ghadar uprising actually comes to an end. But what about the Ghadar fighters? What about the Ghadar revolutionaries in India? And to add to this, even the Ghadar network in USA will also, by the time the World War ends, even the Ghadar leaders in USA will be arrested by the US government. Why? Because US enters on the side of Britain in the First World War, so they become allies. Right? And since these Ghadar leaders were trying to create rebellion with the help of the Germans, right, they'll be arrested and they'll be even given imprisonment. For example, Taraknath Das, who was the founder of this Free Hindustan newspaper, so he'll be even given imprisonment, but the period of imprisonment will be very, very mild in US, just 2 or 3 years of imprisonment compared to the life sentence that is being given in India. Right? So those trials that used to happen in USA during this time, they were called as the German Hindu trials. Okay, because of the participation between Ghadar leaders and the Germans. So it was a series of trials called as the German Hindu trials, which will be carried out in USA during the same time. Right? And now the Ghadar leaders who have now infiltrated and who have been in India, what about them now? What is going to be their activities in the upcoming years? In the upcoming years, after the First World War ends, there is a lot of discontentment in the minds of the Punjabis. Why? A lot of Punjabis were forcefully recruited to fight in the Indian army, and that Indian army went to Mesopotamia, they went to Turkey, they fought against the Ottoman Empire, and it was there in those theatres of conflict where the Punjabi soldiers fought alongside the British soldiers. And many of these campaigns were disastrous, they were failed campaigns. For example, the Gallipoli campaign, where Winston Churchill tried to break the defense of Dardanelles, right? So a lot of Indian lives were lost because of the mismanagement of war by the Britishers. A lot of precious Sikh lives were lost. So that's why there was a lot of anger in Punjab by the time the First World War ends, right? And that anger finds itself in the form of very sporadic protests against the British government. And one such protest, which will turn out to be a bloody massacre in Punjab, would be the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, right? And it is at the end of Jallianwala Bagh massacre, now Gandhiji emerges onto the scene. So he declares to go on a non-cooperation Khilafat movement, and Gandhiji promises to get Swaraj within 1 year, right? He says, give me 1 year and I'll win Swaraj for you. And so this was the time when all these revolutionaries, the Ghadarites, the Anshulan Samiti, existing network of revolutionaries, all of them were ready to discard the revolutionary path to allow chance for Gandhiji to experiment with this path of non-violent movement, right? And when the non-cooperation movement was high in its tempo, that was the time Britishers wanted to win the goodwill of Indians. So some of these revolutionaries would be released. Arabindo Ghosh, Ullaskar Dutt and Sachin Sanyal, right? Many of them from Andamans would all be released during this period of time, right? So these revolutionaries come to India, but still they would have hopes on Gandhi. They would still not take up the path of violence. But over time, Gandhian methods would be failing. Communal violence would just erupt in different parts of this country. And with the Chauri Chaura incident, finally non-cooperation movement comes to an end. And now is when the revolutionaries wanted to simply discard, abandon the non-violent path. They want to once again take up the path of bomb, the path of violence, right? So now the second phase starts with reorganizing the networks of revolutionaries, and it is once again Sachin Sanyal who takes up the task of reorganizing the network, right? And it was during this time Sachin Sanyal would start writing an autobiography of his life. So his real intent of writing it is so that the future generations don't forget about the movement, and also the movement should not be misinterpreted. It should not be maligned by the Britishers by their own version. It is to prevent that from happening. That is when Sachin Sanyal now decides to write an autobiography of his life, in which we get very valuable ideas and inputs about all these revolutionary networks, all their contacts and all of that, right? So he writes 2 books. One of the book is named as Bandi Jeevan. Bandi Jeevan means life in captivity, right? So that's a revolutionary literature which will inspire thousands of revolutionaries in the upcoming years. In fact, Bhagat Singh and his entire comrades would be those who would be inspired reading Bandi Jeevan. So Sachin Sanyal's book is Bandi Jeevan, right? So just remember this. So this is a book that Sachin Sanyal writes after being released in 1921. So he writes a revolutionary literature called as Bandi Jeevan. Okay, and over the course of time, he would also be writing another book by the name of Vinmay Vichar. Okay, so these are some books which can be attributed to Sachin Sanyal, right? So now is his responsibility to reorganize a network of revolutionaries, and during this time, the focus would now shift to the northern Gangetic plains, right? UP, Bihar, Punjab. So this is where now our focus would shift towards. So this is what can be called as the second phase of revolutionary terrorism in India. All right. So let's have a look at who were the prominent revolutionaries of this particular period.